Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. You know, as you guys do probably know, if you are on chess.com at all, we do have the Rapid Chess Championship going on right now. This is week 25. So I got the game Wesley versus Hikaru Nakamura. So hopefully I'll do these guys justice. I always, hope that when I do a video, if the players ever saw the video, which I think I'd have to blow up a little bit more than I am now. But if they ever saw my video, they would say, hey, man, this guy, he did a pretty good job, So hopefully. Anyways, for all of my people that are coming from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking makaibigan? Hello ulit. Magandang umaga, magandang araw, magandang gabi. Almasal tayo. It's like 10 o'clock almost in the morning over there, so I think pretty much everybody's had breakfast. All my somewhat early risers, so I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. If you guys are ready to go, all right, cool. Let's take a look and see what we got for this game. All right, man, so we got the move e4, e5. Knight comes to f3. We got knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6. We got d3. So after we see the move bishop to c5, we do have the Giuoco Pianissimo. We got castles by white, and we have d6 as black. And I mean, this is like the most scary position that you could get into in chess. I'm scared. You guys scared too. We gonna get through this together. Nah, I'm playing. It's not that scary. But as you guys know, in Italian it does say Giuoco Pianissimo is very quiet game. But you guys know that this is not like a Berlin. It's not rare, but it's not as common to see draws. So, you normally have decisive games. So we do see the move c3. We don't want any shenanigans with this knight. We're saying, hey, bro, don't jump into one of these squares or you'll die. You don't want to die. So we do see the move a6. We got rook over to e1. We see the move h6, knight b to d2, and we see all like really general Giuoco Pianissimo maneuvering. The bishop drops back to a7. We see bishop back to b3. We got castles as black. Knight comes down to f1. And I mean, like I said, this is like, super duper the plan as white. You're redirecting the knight over to g3 normally. And then, maybe a bishop comes here or something like that. So, this is very common waters that we're in. We see the move rook to e8. We see h3. Bishop to g4 can be just maybe a touch annoying, so we don't want to allow it. The bishop does come to e6, and then we see the move bishop to c2. And for those of you that are wondering, it was actually legitimate to trade on e6 as well. So if you did want to go bishop takes and then rook takes, that would be perfectly fine as well. So it pretty much just kind of comes down to like, how you want to how you want to specifically play the game yourself. And so we do see the move d5, and this is the perfect time, to do a pawn break. So, Naka decides, hey, man, this is a good time, and the computer agrees. It's pretty much one of the only, it's literally the only pawn break you have on the board. But what you don't want to allow as black is allow white to play d4, because in this particular position, if you push d4, you trade. White just literally has like a super gigantic pawn center. And then, of course, also you're looking at this, pawn forking these two pieces. So you don't really want to allow that. So this is perfectly timed d5, pawn takes, and then we see knight taking. And then the move knight came to g3, like I said before. Now, if we back up, some of you guys might have been looking at the situation. I realize I didn't do that. Okay. Yeah, I don't have a guess the move. Maybe I just won't have one for this game. That's fine. I'll see if I can wing it, but probably not. Anyway, so you guys might be sitting here wondering in this position, if you're doing your calculating, you're doing your counting, you're saying, okay, knight takes here, rook takes, right? Like, can I just win a pawn here? Well, the problem is in this particular position, it would actually be a pretty bad blunder to take this pawn here. Not game ending, but it would be pretty questionable to do that, and I will show you exactly why. If we did happen to take knight takes here, rook takes here, and you're like, man, you know what? I got everything covered, man. Like, there's not any discoveries over here because the rook is going to take with check over here, and then I'm going to win a bishop, right? Man, okay. But you wouldn't be focused on the correct thing. Bishop takes f2, check, exclam. Not a super exclam, but it's a really, really great move. And I mean, you really kind of want to sidestep with the king here. But if just for illustration purposes, if we do take on f2 with the king, you would be looking at queen to f6 with check. No! Yeah, you don't want to have that happen because your rook is going to go bye-bye. And we don't want to just give up our rooks for no reason. So going back in the game, Wesley So was like, bro, I'm a gangster, I'm a G. I know this stuff, so he plays knight to g3. We got queen down to d6. Perfect developing move. Not only is it protecting the pawn, you know, for future cases, but it is connecting your rooks. And as of this moment, you know, black is a little bit further ahead in development than white is. So white got a little bit of catching up to do. So we do see the move knight to h4. We see rook a to d8. Knight h goes to f5. We see bishop takes f5. Knight takes f5. And the crazy thing is, I did a video a couple videos ago with this almost exact you know, maneuver. And so you are getting this nice little outpost for the knight, and the queen is hit. So you do kind of have a little bit going on. The queen sidesteps over to f6, and then we do see the move queen to g4. We are threatening checkmate here as white. And you know the craziest thing about it? Hikaru goes queen to e6, and we see checkmate. No, I'm playing. We didn't see that. You guys are like, what? That's it? No, no, he does not do that. Like, Hikaru is literally like, dude, I'm more gangster than this, so I'm just making a joke. So, going back, like I said, we did see the move queen to g4. And of course, Naka is going to be doing something that's going to prevent the end of the game. So what we see him do is the novelty, which is the move h5. And this is kind of asking a question to the queen. What does it want to do? Also, it moves it off of h6 because at the moment, either knight takes h6 or bishop takes h6 was on tap. So you have to do something to prevent against that. What we have seen in the past is knight c to e7. This is a maneuver that we have seen. And it's one of the best moves, but this is what Naka comes up with on his own. But you know, you have to do something about this position because I mean, you know, you had a lot of fire coming on this h6 square, and of course, you know, like I said, you had checkmate threatened here, so you got to do something about that. So we do see the move queen to g5. The queen takes g5, bishop takes g5, and this was definitely the best way to go about it as black. And then we see the move f6, and we're backing this bishop up to d2. We see the move knight to g. We see the move g6, and we're like, dang, bro, like, why are you pushing my pieces around, dog? So we got knight coming back to g3, the king coming up to g7. So, like I said, I mean, white definitely has a nice advantage here, but you know, black has still done what they needed to do, and they are in a very legitimate position. We see the move a4. We got knight coming to f4, and then the bishop takes on f4, pawn takes f4, and then we do see the move knight to e4. And I mean, everything is fairly even. You know, it is a little questionable to keep this king here on g1. So we see that this is rectified very soon. So we see the move rook to e7. We got d4, blocking that bishop. After we see rook to d to e8, we do see the move king to f1. So, you know, basically, literally what I just talked about is taken care of. And you have to be very careful because the main reason that you went king over to f1 instead of, like, let's say king to h1 or king to h2 is because the move f5 was coming. And the problem is, I mean, you're just really under defended if you don't move the king over here to f1. So f1 was absolutely necessary, and Wesley so recognized that. That's why he's a gangster mode. Malaka C. Wesley. So we got bishop taking d4. Which looks kind of crazy. That's probably where I could have did to guess the move. But like I said, we just won't have one for this game. Maybe I got one, but I don't think I did. Pawn takes d4. A knight goes down to b4. We see a rook e goes to c1. Knight takes c2. Rook takes c2. Rook takes e4. And then we do have rook taking c7 with check. The king, rook 8 comes to e7. We see rook takes. We see rook takes. And then we got rook over to d1. And it might kind of seem like, you know, like white, even though they're not up a pawn, like they got this super pass pawn in the middle of the board. Well, everything is dead even. And this is a perfect illustration. What Nakamura does here is show you exactly how you should go about playing this in an endgame. And it is a very subtle type of maneuvering, but I will be able to explain exactly, like, you know, what that type of a thought process was. And, you know, it's these little subtle differences that make certain players certain levels. So the king goes over to f7. That starts the maneuver first. We got d5. We see rook dropping down to e4. We see d6. We got king up to e8. We see d7 with check, and then the king comes over to d8. So what Hikaru Nakamura has decided to do in this position, which is pretty much the best possible thing that you can do, is he decided to use his king to blockade the pawn, and he kept his rook active. So not only is his rook active, his rook is on this open file, and it's really preventing the king from like moving over to do anything on the queen side of the board. So if you flip it and do it the other way and just say, hey, I'm going to move the rook back behind, this would be like a beginner, intermediate type of decision. And the problem is you're just going to jam your rook on d8 and make it completely inactive. And those that have seen my videos before, that is the last thing that you want a rook to be doing. Literally, if we just kind of show, a situation, let's say instead of doing that, we do this and then we do this and stuff like this. I mean, that is really not where you want your rook to be. You see, I mean, the white has a lot more movability in the situation. Of course, you got to move your rook up, but you can see this is a much better position than the other one. So going back to what we had in the game, like I said, the king went up to d8, and then we do see the move b3. We see rook up to e6. We got h4. Trying to do a little bit of freeze, but, black just kind of has too many pawns right here. So he just decides to push and get rid of his pawn weakness. So the pawn takes g5, pawn takes g5, and then we have the rook up to d5. So we see the rook coming over to b6, and Wesley so decides that he wants to start to kind of grab some pawns instead of defending. So, I mean, you can either defend or you can attack. The rook takes on g5. We see rook taking b3. We got rook taking h5. We got the move f3. And I mean, we're pretty much threatening mate here if you don't really do anything as white. If you make any other move, the rook can go ahead and slide down to b1, and that's checkmate. So, you got to kind of do something about it. So you got to double your pawns up. Pawn takes f3, rook takes f3, and then we do see the move rook over to d5, defending the pawn. So we're up a pawn. We got b5, pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, and then we do have the move king to e2. We got rook up to f6, rook takes b5, and then we do see rook to e6 with check. King goes to f3, and then we do see rook takes d7. And we are in a fairly even position, even though white is up a complete pawn. It is possible to draw this position. We do see the move king to f4, trying to create some space, and of course, we want to get out from in front of our pawn. The rook comes down to e2. We see king back down to f3. We see the rook going over to e6. We see rook down to b4. We got rook to f6 with check. And the rook comes to f4. And we kind of have like a reverse, like building a bridge Lucena position situation going on over here. And of course, you absolutely do not want to take this rook with your rook. These are the types of things, like I said before, that separate, your average everyday, like, beginner player and, the players that are these levels, because, you start to kind of calculate moves and like what I should and shouldn't type of do. And I mean, even though it might not look super crazy, the most important thing in the position is the king's position. And I mean, if it's possible to draw or win or, kind of lose the game. So what we see Hikaru do is absolutely avoid the trade, rook to h6, which is correct. But backing up, if we did go ahead, just to illustrate to you guys what I meant a second ago, if we did capture on f4, you see the bar just go crazy, you would be taking with the king. And then the problem is there's not really much you can do in this position. And the majority, the biggest reason why is because white has what we call reserve tempi. And basically what that means is they always have the ability to let me see, like outflank and oppose the opponent's king, but then it also has that extra move or two that it can like employ with the pawn. So it might look something like this. The king, let's say, would come down to e6. You can start to outflank with king to g5, and you are always going to be able to get yourself in a position to where when you do need to force the black king to move, you can literally just either just make one pawn move, or you can just move the pawn all the way over here, just depending on the position. But it is a completely won in game as white. So that is why we do not see Hikaru trade pieces there. We do see, like I said, rook to h6. We see rook over to e4. The rook comes back to f6 with check. The king goes to g3. We see a rook over to g6. We see king to h4. The rook goes back over to f6. And unfortunately, as you can see, white is in a completely winning position. And it is because of the position that we will be able to get into in a second. We got the move f4. The rook goes back to f8. We see king to g5. And we are just allowing ourselves to get in too great of a position in this particular situation. Rook goes to g8 with check. We see king over to h6. The rook comes down to g4. The king goes to h5 and it attacks the rook. The rook comes back up to g8. We see the move f5, and it is in this position that Hikaru Nakamura resigns the game. Now, I can understand pretty much everybody, not every single person, but I think I can understand a majority of people, you know, being like kind of curious as to why the game got over, because it looks like, it's not like completely obvious as to why like Hikaru Nakamura resigned the game. Of course, you know, these are super GMs that are playing, so in their mind, they're calculating like, oh, this is completely lost. I messed up somewhere. But it's their experience within games. So to illustrate why this is completely losing for black, there's two different variations that I'll go into. So if we just continue the game with one of those moves, you know, basically, if you want to, as black, let's say you want to pursue this rook, right? As, you know, black, you want to try to start to come into the rook. You would be making the move king to d6. This was one of, like, the moves that you could make. You would see the move f6. The rook would slide over to f8. We would see king to g6. The rook might come back over and check this way. And we would be seeing king going to h7. And then the problem is now, once you move your rook back over to f8, the king would go back to g7, and it is covering all three of those corner squares. So the only really thing that you can try in this position is to come behind the pawn. So rook would be going back to g7. You would see the pawn push to f7. The rook would go to f3. You would see the king go to g7. Rook to g3 with check. That would force the king. This is ideally what you want to do, is force the king in front of the pawn so that it can't move. But after the king goes to d5, you see rook down to e2. Rook to f3. And then the king sidesteps over to e7. And the problem is, once this pawn pushes and promotes, you're going to have to give the rook up. And then you pretty much just have a king and a rook versus a king, which you guys know is completely 100% won. That is one of the possibilities. If I went back to the move f5, which is, like I said, where Hikaru resigned the game. If we chose another option, let's just say that we want to like defend against the pawn moving immediately, right? You would see the move rook to f8. The king would go to g6. So it would be somewhat kind of similar to what we saw before. The rook would go over to g8 with check. The king would go up to f7. And, I mean, you have a similar situation, like I said. I mean, you can always move over to h8 with the rook, but then the king is going to go to g7. And you pretty much just took care of all three of these squares. So that is the main thing that you want to do with your king, force the rook away. And so in this position, you would probably see something similar like rook to g3. You would see the pawn pushing to f6, rook going over to f3, rook to d4 with check. You also want to try to move the king over another square just to give you a little bit of room. The king would go over to c6. You'd see king over to e7. You see rook to e3 with check. You got the king going back to f8, the rook going back to f3. You have f7. And you have achieved what I think quite a few of you understand as far as in-games is concerned, a Lucena position. So like I mentioned a little bit before, you have the Lucena position here. And you are trying to get in that ideal build the bridge position. So what that looks like is exactly this. Rook would go over to g3. You don't really want to allow this king to step out because, you know, you're going to be able to just pretty much push the pawn. So the king would have to step back over to e3 or e7. Rook would come to e3 with check, and then the king would come down to f6. Rook would go to f3 with check, and then the most important move in the process of building the bridge is stepping over to g6, keeping contact with the pawn, and then after you receive the next check, then come down, and then once the rook comes back over to f3, you would be looking at rook to f4, and you have just achieved the bridge in the Lucena position. And as you guys are probably aware, it's the key to all end games, rook end games. And you have basically made a situation where on the next move, you know, or like after the rooks trade off, you are going to be getting whatever piece you want to get when you promote. So, it's a little bit long. I don't try to go this long ever, but I mean, I thought it was important to explain, you know, that type of an end game and why it seemed like Hikaru resigned in a somewhat kind of an even position. So hopefully this gives you guys a little bit of better understanding as to why the game got over. And I absolutely will be shooting a light analysis video. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of here before I hit 20 minutes. I appreciate you guys very much. Maraming salamat, the King Makai Ibigan, and I'll see you guys next time.